Philadelphia, Dr. Matthew Levendusky. Matthew is a professor of political science, as well as the Stephen and Mary Barron Chair in the Institutions of Democracy at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He was previously the Penny and Robert A. Fox Director of the Fels Institute of Government. His research focuses on understanding how institutions and elites influence the political behavior of ordinary citizens. This broad question is taken up in studies of mass polarization, voter cue-taking, the impact of partisan media on ordinary voters, and a variety of other substantive questions. He is the author of Our Common Bonds, Using What Americans Share to Help Bridge the Partisan Divide, published in 2023. And we look forward to learning more about the book. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matt. Thanks.
Okay, so thanks so much for joining me here today. So I'm going to be talking with you a little bit about the book that I published a couple of months ago called Our Common Bonds. When I start giving these sort of talks, the slide's a little bit dated, but I think it sums up the problem well, so you'll see why it's dated in a minute. Because one of the things that political scientists and commentators have talked about in the last couple of years is a problem of what scientists tend to call affective polarization, but sometimes you might hear partisan animosity or partisan hostility. I think the graphic is a good description of this, right? So it's very 2016, right? But it kind of gives you the basic flavor. So if you can't see it, it's a Trump and Hillary Clinton supporter yelling at each other saying you're deplorable, right? So the idea of affective polarization, right, is that it's not just that people might disagree on the issues, right? But it's that people can't get along, right? That they dislike each other, that they don't want to spend time with each other, they don't want the other person as their friend, as their roommate, as their coworker, right? Lots of different sort of outcomes have been studied, right? Sometimes this gets called avoidance, right? That people don't want to have interactions with one another, right? And so there's been a lot of work on this, documenting a bunch of different harms that this produces, both sort of socially and politically, right? So politically, it contributes, it's not the only factor, but it contributes to things like gridlock and dissensus in government, right? And socially, I think it sort of weakens that social glue by making people less willing to engage with one another, right? So some of the work that I've done over the last couple of years, some of it with Dom, is trying to better understand how we might minimize some of this, right? And so the argument that I make in the book, and I'll kind of just give you a broad overview of it today, is that this partisan animosity is a real thing, right? But partly it's rooted in misperceptions of the other side, right? And I'll explain in a minute where some of those misperceptions come from, right? So some of it is sort of genuine and rooted in real differences, but part of it is that people have a skewed sense of who the other side is, what they believe, and what they stand for, right? And so in part because they have this skewed sense, right, they have this inflated dislike for the other side. And so what I've done and what I've been working on is showing that if you correct some of these misperceptions, right, you can reduce some of that animosity because you can show people that some of what they think about the other side isn't correct, right? So you can kind of remove some of those misperceptions, and that might help to minimize some of that animosity, right? And the way in which, well, there are different ways you can do it, but what we'll focus on today and what I talk about in the book are ways of building on what we share together, right? Hence the name of the Common Bonds, right? But one really important caveat that I always like to make at the beginning of these talks, there is no silver bullet. There's no, if you've seen those old web ads, one weird trick to a flat belly or something like that, that does not exist for polarization, right? What we can do realistically is we can minimize, right? Minimize, reduce, ameliorate, whatever phrase you'd like, right? We cannot eliminate or remove this altogether, right? That we're talking about a reduction in animosity, not the elimination of animosity. So in today's talk, what I'm going to be doing is I'll tell you a little bit about where animus comes from. We'll talk about two different strategies. There's some more in the book, but I wanted to make the talk maybe a little bit shorter so that we leave more time for questions and discussion. So we'll talk briefly about two of those strategies. And then I always like to close, especially with mixed kind of audiences, with some maybe more kind of practical sorts of advice. So let's start by talking about where animus originates from. And so if you've read any of this literature, right, you know that animosity tends to come from what political scientists and social psychologists call social identity. And what is social identity? It's just the idea that when I say like, oh, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, right, that I come to kind of say like, that's part of my identity, that thing, right, in social, because you're part of a social group, right, and that's an important part of how I see myself, right? So I'm a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, right? My team is team blue, not team red, right? And that's part of it, right? So there's a lot of work that people have done to unpack this, but that's a very incomplete explanation, right? Because all of the social identity stuff and this group centrism, which is like the very dorky academic term for this, right? We like to invent terms for like things. So we say, you know, this intimates something instead of it is something, or, you know, like we can't ever let just a simple word be, right? So this is definitely part of the story. But I think there's two things, and one of them I think is in particular important for these misperceptions. So partly this comes about because of politics and conflict, right? But I actually think in some ways for our talk today, actually the mass media and social media are going to be an important source of these misperceptions. And why do I talk about there? Well, I think it's important to kind of group these last two things together. By the way, is the microphone helping, not helping? Oh, it's helping? Okay, great. I'm used to shouting, but it's never like, it sounds weird to me, but that's just enough here. Okay, so I think these two things we can kind of lump together, these last two things, right? And so why do I lump them together? So think about what does the media like to talk about, right? So if you read kind of classic column books or frankly just open the New York Times, right? One of the key news values of newsworthiness is conflict, right? Because that shows that there's some like issue at stake, right? It's not very exciting. The New York Times doesn't leave with a lot of stories like most Americans agree XYZ is true, right? Much more exciting to say like showdown in Washington, D.C. over future of, you know, fill in the blank, right? Can Tuberville be stopped from blocking military appointments, right? All these sorts of things, framing things around conflict, right? And where do we see most conflict? We see it at the elite level, right? And because our social networks, right, the people we know and interact with tend to be like us, right? So the technical term for that is they're homophilous, right? We know a lot about people who are like us. If I'm a Democrat, I know lots of other Democrats, right? I know fewer Republicans. So if I think about Republicans, right, and I think about it, I might think about, say, former President Trump or Vivek Ramaswamy or, you know, Mike Pence or whoever, right? But it tends to be these elite figures who like to drive a lot of consensus and conflict, right? But the media also matters in this second way, and that's social media, right? And so think about what social media does, right, from a political perspective. So there's really good data from Pew that only about 10% of people ever post about social media on their social media, or sorry, post about politics on their social media feeds, right? So most people actually don't like talking about politics. But something like 2/3, 3/4 of people see politics in their social media feed. And why is that? Because there's a small set of people who love to talk about politics. And they tend to skew towards people who are high in conflict, right? And those are the posts that generate a lot of engagement. So the algorithm, which I don't think you can blame for that much, but like it's designed to show you things that are engaging. Those posts are very engaging. So those rise to the top, right? So if you ask most people to think about, right, who someone who's not like them is like, right? They tend to draw on those really accessible stereotypes, right? And that's a lot of who they're going to draw on, right? So in that sense, right, some of this is about those misperceptions, right? Because it's the case that, you know, most people aren't that politically interested, but you tend to think about, right? But you might not know that someone who's not very politically interested, you might never learn their party ID. Instead, the kinds of people where you're likely to learn that, especially if they're not people who are close to you, are people who are very extreme, are very engaged. So it's going to lead to some misperceptions. So let me just give you one quick piece of evidence of this. So this is from a study published last year in the Journal of Politics that I did with Jamie Druckman, Sam Clark, Yana Krupnikov, and John Ryan. So we asked some people, we said, just two very simple questions. So some people are asked, how interested are you in talking about politics? Do you talk about politics rarely, occasionally, frequently? So we wanted to keep it really simple, right? And then we said, like, oh, do you think of yourself as a liberal, moderate, or conservative? So some people tell you what they think, so we have some measure of truth. And then other people, we said, oh, when you think about people from the other party, right, would you say that the average person from the other party talks about politics rarely, occasionally, frequently? Are they liberal, moderate, or conservative? Right. So the gray bar is what people tell us that how they actually self-describe. The black bar is what people perceive. Right. And so here we're going to pool Democrats and Republicans because in many of these things, they end up looking really similar. Right. And so I just want to draw your attention to the kind of these two, this first bar, the second one tells more or less the same story. Right. So if you look, about a quarter of people say, I really actually don't like to talk about politics. But people think that only 5% of people from the other party actually are like that, right? Half of people talk about it occasionally, but they only think that it's really about it. People think it's about a third, right? And they think that over 60%, almost 2/3 talk about it all the time, but it's really only about a quarter, right? And so we see a very similar pattern here with ideology where people think other people are more extreme than they are, right? So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about misperceptions, right? That people have an inaccurate picture of the other side. And there's been a lot of work on this in the last couple of years, right? These are just two sort of easy examples. Lots of other work on, support for democratic norms, support for political violence, right? Lots of different things where people think the other side, but they tend to cast them in more extreme and less positive perceptions than it is in reality, right? So the two strategies that we'll talk about today, and again, there's a little bit more in the book we can talk about if people are interested, are about trying to reduce some of this type of animosity, right? Correcting some of these types of misperceptions, although not these two in particular, right? To try and help people have a more accurate sense of the other side, right? To see where, progress might be possible. So let's talk about those two strategies, right? So the first one is going to be to exploit cross-party friendship. Now, friendship here is just kind of a catch-all term for kind of relationships, right, with people from the other side. So relationship sounds kind of weird, so I just usually call it friendship as the generic, right? So this is a strategy where you might sort of initially say, do you know, people, if you're a Democrat, do you know, people who are Republicans? You might think, oh, no. Those people they're out there. I don't know anyone like that. All my friends are normal. But if you actually stop and think about it, and I'll show you some evidence of this in a minute, most people actually do know people from the other side, right? Most people they know are more like them than not, right? But we do tend to know people from the other side. And then if you ask them to think about that person and maybe reflect on, why they value having them in their life, they're like, oh, I'm a Democrat, but my friend John is a Republican. And, he's really like a nice guy. He's very involved with his church. He does a lot of community service. Like, there's a lot of good things about him. So yeah, he's like a good guy, right? And then I kind of ask you to think about, well, maybe do you think there are some other Republicans like that? And I think like, oh yeah, I bet there are some, right? That this is someone, right? That they've got some more kind of positive traits than you might think, right? So that can be a way of kind of changing your perception, right? So instead of just thinking about, right, your crazy, high school, friend who you haven't seen in 30 years, but you're for some reason Facebook friends with, just giving example at random, right, that you see ranting about politics, right? You'll maybe think about someone like that, right, where you kind of know them in a different way, right? And so you can think about them a little bit more positively, right? So that's going to change the way you think about this. So let me now show you a little bit of the data about what some of those relationships look like, show you a little bit of evidence for how that works, and then talk a little bit about why, like some of the reasons why the strategy is effective. Right, so the first thing you might be saying is like, okay, well, what's the evidence that people actually know people from the other side? So I've done a bunch of surveys myself of this, but they all line up with this data from Pew, so we'll start there. And so Pew, as part of their American Trends panel, asked people, oh, do you know people from, how many of your friends are people who are not like you along a variety of different dimensions, right? Just one of them is partisanship, right? And so this is looking at the number of people who are from the other party, right? So if you're a Democrat, like, do you have friends who are Republicans? If you're a Republican, do you have friends who are Democrats, right? And so you can see about 10% of people don't have any friends from the other party, right? And that's pretty consistent, right? But somewhere between 80, 85, 90%, depends exactly on how you ask the question, but between 8 and 9 out of 10 of us have at least some friends. Now, most people don't have a lot, right? They have a few or they have some, right? But people do actually know people that they like and respect, right? Or friends with, right? From the other side. And what's interesting is that in one of my studies, I asked people to kind of break down and describe to us who these people were. And I thought mostly they would be family members, but they're actually not. They're people who are just generally friends, right? That most people, if you ask them, right, it's their friendships that are the main source of this. Right? For some people, it's family. For other people, coworkers, neighbors, etc. Right? But friends is actually the kind of dominant sense. And maybe you're thinking, okay, well, these are people we don't know well. These are people on the periphery of our social networks, but that's not true either, right? So that again, in one of the studies, I said, well, so we asked them to make it easier to talk about a specific person. We said, how close are you to that person, right? And so something like, 85% of people are at least somewhat close, right? With the modal answer being that they're very close to that person, right? So that these are not people who are just kind of at the fringes of our social networks, but these are people that we actually tend to know reasonably well. And that'll turn out to be an important part of the story we'll come back to in a few minutes. So then we can talk about some evidence for whether or not this works. So one thing that the social scientists do to try and measure partisan animosity is they use a variety of different trait ratings, right? So there's psychologists who have developed these batteries of trait ratings that you can use to assess how people feel about other people, right? So these are traits like you might say, how well does the word honest describe someone? How well, does that describe a Democrat or Republican? How well does generous? How well does mean-spirited, right? So it's balanced, some positive, some negative, right? And so you can use that as a sense to see that, how people kind of feel about the other side. So here I'm just going to show you one of those trait ratings, but this is pretty standard what happens on some of the other ones, and we'll show you some other evidence later in the second strategy. Okay, so this one is how well does honest apply, right? And so the answers could be not at all well, not too well, somewhat well, very well, or extremely well, right? So partly, I always like to begin by saying, right, this is always about reduction, not elimination, because in both the black bar, the people who are in the control, they were asked to think about where they'd like to go on vacation, just to have them do something that's about the same length. People in the gray bars, the people who are asked to think about who's someone they know from the other side and why they like and respect that person, right? The modal category in both cases is the not too well case, right? So we're not by any means eliminating this, right? But what we are doing is we're shifting down. And in particular, what we're doing is we're taking people from this category of not at all well and putting them in the somewhat well category, right? So we're reducing animosity, but by no means are we kind of eliminating it. And we see that very consistently across these sorts of things, right? That's why I talk about this being a strategy of amelioration rather than cessation or elimination, right? And so partly why I said I wanted to bring up the point about closeness is we did some kind of follow-up work, and my sort of thought after I saw the first study that I did of this is like, oh, well, maybe this is coming from people who either aren't very close to the other person or the people that don't talk about politics with the other person, right? Maybe like I'm friends with Dom, but I know we're going to disagree, so we just never bring up politics. But fascinatingly, it's actually the exact opposite of this, right? That the biggest effects come from people where these people are close and that they talk about politics more often, right? So we have to be a little careful about pushing this too far because there's, the causality there gets a little bit ambiguous. But I think what it's suggestive of is that we need the kind of closeness of these bonds to be able to have these kind of conversations across lines of difference. And we need to actually have those kinds of conversations, right, in order to do this. If we just avoid it, right, that doesn't help us. What we need to do to help things is to actually do things to try and bridge those sorts of divides. So then that leads us into our second strategy, which is going to be focused on cross-party discussion. So this is work that based on work that Dom and I did in 2018 and 2019, back in that time, so long ago before the pandemic, when what we did was we traveled around the metro Philadelphia area and brought Democrats and Republicans together at community centers, libraries, town halls, right, to have these sort of cross-party discussions to see if this could help reduce this animosity. And you might say, well, why should this work? And it's going to work on that kind of misperception mechanism for a couple of reasons, I think. The first one is it's going to learn about, you might learn about some common ground, right? So Democrats and Republicans initially think that, oh, we don't really agree on anything, right? Because if you watch the news, that's very much the story you get. And it's true, like on a certain set of high profile issues, right? There's a lot of disagreement. But on a lot of other issues, right, there's actually a lot more consensus, right? Even if you dig below the surface on something like abortion, right? Very long-term, very stable consensus in both parties about sort of what those things should look like, right? Not to say there's not disagreements, right? But there's actually a fair amount of kind of common ground there. But that's actually not the most important reason. I think the most important reason is the second one, right? And that's what the literature calls perspective taking, but I always like to call perspective getting, right? So part of what happens in a conversation is that you get to learn about why other people think the way that they do, right? So we know from a lot of work in psychology, right, that we're really, really bad at knowing how other people who aren't like us think, right? So when I started this project, I was talking to one of my colleagues. Over the years, become very close with his parents, and his mom was a very big Democratic activist. And I was explaining to her about like why I'm doing this project. And she's like, here's what you need to tell those Trump supporters. She's a big Democratic activist. She's like, you need to tell them they're all stupid. They've been duped by a con man, and they're all very gullible. She's like, when you show them the facts, they're gonna just come to their senses and leave him behind. I was like, well, I don't really think that she's like, no, that's how it's gonna work. Just reader, that's not how it works. Right? People, or if you do that, people actually really, really just like that, it turns out. So why is perspective, I call it perspective getting, because what you're doing is if I'm in a conversation with someone who maybe takes a different position from me, and I say, well, that's so interesting, can you explain to me why you feel that way and what's your rationale for that? They might have a whole set of well-developed reasons, right? Why they feel that way, that draws on particular kind of core values for them about why those things are important to them, and it draws on kind of long-standing traditions and parts of their beliefs that are really valuable to them, right? And they may well still not agree with them at all, right? In fact, right, common ground increases somewhat, right? But the bigger effect seems to be that people sort of say like, oh, I kind of understand where they're coming from. They're still wrong, right? But at least I kind of see where they're coming from, right? And that's why I think that perspective getting is so valuable. And what I always tell people, that sometimes they get asked to talk to like groups, and a lot of political groups are interested in eventually persuading the other side. What I always tell people is that persuasion will always be completely ineffective until you understand where the other person is coming from, because you've got to be able to come at it from their point of view if you actually want to convince them of why you're right. And there's a third reason, and this is something that turned out to be important, but I didn't realize it would be important when I started it. And it's that people actually really value the sense of respect they get. So we modeled civility a lot in the experiments, just in large part because it's kind of looking at how other people had structured deliberation experiments. But I'm increasingly convinced this is a really kind of valuable and really important part of these kind of conversations. And sometimes people mistake the word civility for politesse. It's not, right? Civility is, so there's a very nice book by Keith and Danish, who are true rhetoricians, who call that sort of civility, they call that weak or meaningless civility, right? And so strong civility, or the civility we want to cultivate, is respecting other people's point of view as legitimate until it's proven otherwise. So in the practical section, I'll talk about what some of the limits to that might be. But I think this also turns out to be important, that people, right, get a chance to hear other people give their point of view, but also feel heard and respected as well, right? So what's some evidence here that this sort of work might work? So here we're going to contrast people who did a kind of cross-party discussion where Democrats and Republicans spoke to one another with people who did an apolitical discussion, right? Here, that apolitical discussion was what are the best beach towns in the mid-Atlantic, and people in the Philly region had very strong opinions about that. Here, one of the items we used is how often can you trust the other party to do what's in the best interest of the country as a whole, right? So the answers are almost always, most of the time, about half the time, once in a while, and almost never. Again, black are the people who are in the apolitical control, gray are the people who are in the kind of discussion condition. And what you can see is very similar to our earlier point with honesty, right? We're moving people largely out of this almost never category into this about half the time. And again, it's this once in a while that's still the dominant category. So even here, right, these effects in general are much larger because it's a much more involved intervention, right? It takes an hour, they have a whole 15-minute discussion, right? That's very different than just doing kind of a brief kind of little thought exercise in a survey, right? But even still, right, we're not eliminating, this is about reducing animosity. One other short piece of evidence we did here was we got what social psychologists call social distance items. Now, this had a totally different meaning when we did this in 2019. It does not mean COVID social distancing. It's from an old idea in social psychology. Basically, it's how willing are you to interact with them? Hence, you are socially distant from them. And so a very classic one that you might have seen talked about in the press is how upset would you be if one of your children married someone who was from the other party, right? So there's been a lot of, this is one that lots of pollsters like to ask. It's shown up on lots of different surveys, and people always like to, talk about this one a lot. So it's one we included. And here it's the same thing. So how upset would you be, or how comfortable would you be? Sorry. And so it's not at all comfortable, not too comfortable, somewhat comfortable, and extremely comfortable, right? And so you can see again, it's the kind of somewhat, but we're taking people mostly from this not too comfortable and moving them more towards extremely comfortable, right? So again, we're kind of reducing down their discomfort with here interacting with someone, right, who's going to be from the other party, right? So this is just, to give you a kind of sample of some of the types of evidence that are in the book. But I think that this sort of discussion is probably in some ways the most practical kind of strategy for doing this. So I'll stop talking in a minute, but I would like to end with maybe something a little bit more practical. Okay, so if the discussion is value, how do you have good conversations? So I think bridging those two strategies, right? One thing I tell people is that use apolitical ties as a bridge, right? So that's where things like those friendships can be that way. The experiment I wanted to do, but then COVID happened, so I couldn't, was to bring like Phillies fans together and have them bond over liking the Phillies and see if that like helped to reduce animosity, right? So they'd have some sort of shared kind of commonality, right? So I did some little kind of survey work that's very suggestive of that, but I think that's like an interesting possibility. I think if I learned one thing from doing this, it's that listening is way, way, way more important than talking. That sounds really strange, especially from a faculty member, because a prerequisite to being a faculty member is that you love the sound of your own voice. If you don't like that, you will not be happy as a faculty member. Little side tip, right? So I think it's really important to listen, and when I say listen fully, like listen carefully and attentively, because we often think we know what other people are going to say, but that's often wrong, right? So listening in an engaged fashion to really understand what people have to say is really important. So this is where I talked about, right, maybe finding some of the boundaries of civility. So practice civility within limits. And so when I talk about like, well, what are the limits of civility, right? Sometimes people say like, well, does that mean, we have to accept people saying things that are, racist or sexist or transphobic or whatever? And no, the answer to that is no, right? So if you look at scholars who study civility, they say, right, that the core of civility, and I think the best articulation of this is from the political theorist and one-time Massachusetts gubernatorial candidate Daniel Allen, right, that civility is about respecting everyone's right to participate fully and equally in the polity, right? And those sorts of attitudes, right, are basically trying to exclude people from the polity. So those are things we have to kind of tolerate civility. So I did this event for the National Constitution Center, and one of the other panelists summed it up very practically in a way that I like, and I've cribbed from him, which is that assume the best in people, right, until they've fully shown you that that's not what they're giving you, and then just break the conversation at that point, right? So if people are not doing this in good faith, then I think it's okay, inconsistent with civility, to kind of just be like, thanks but no thanks. And I think also asking probing questions is really important, right? So when I say that, like, ask questions that maybe kind of get at the deeper meaning of things, or don't just kind of reify existing differences, right? So a good example of this, one that I worked on with some groups, wasn't like, what's something you like about, your party, but what's something where your party disappoints you, or one thing you wish they did differently, right? Because that might open up a kind of more deeper reflection, or something that might kind of get people a little bit out of their comfort zone. And then just kind of practically, I tell people that start small. Like, this doesn't have to be like a big thing. It's just, you know, something you can kind of practice in the day-to-day, and it's okay if it doesn't work. It doesn't always work, and I think sometimes people, it's very easy to get, you know, disappointed if it doesn't work all the time, right? But it's something like, this is a skill like anything else you have to learn and develop over time. So if you want to hear more about this, so Dom and I have a short book on the discussion experiments. There's more on that and some of these other strategies in the other book. If you don't have a copy and you'd like one, just, you know, let me know. I think I don't have many copies left of that, but I do still have a bunch of copies of that. So with that, I will stop talking and turn it over to the panel. So thanks so much for coming out today.
All right, thank you so much, Matt. That was great. And I encourage everybody, oh, the book is no longer behind me. Read the book. Matt is one of the few scholars who writes in a way that is accessible and doesn't make you want to fall off a bridge. So definitely encourage you to check out Our Common Bonds. Since I didn't get to do introductions, I'm gonna sneak two things in. One is to thank Sam Hodeling, who's now in the back of the room again, because he has been instrumental in putting together a lot of the events for the democracy that we have given up to him. And hopefully this is first of many that we have for you this year. And then the second person I want to thank is Elise Dietrich, who's right there, who logistically ensured that you all have things to eat and a place to sit. So thank you, Elise. Give it up for you. So I have planned for 90 to 120 minutes of my personal remarks. Then I was told I shouldn't do that. So I had some questions, but before I get to those, I'm gonna give maybe Martine and Katie, who have done a lot of this work, this applied work at the CPD, to maybe have some remarks as a response if they want to. And then I have some questions that I'm gonna ask Matthew and our panelists. And then we'll open it up to the rest of you. So we should have enough time to go through all of that. So Martine, Katie,
yeah. So I'm Martine Carcasson, Communication Studies Professor here and founder and director of the Center for Public Deliberation, which does a lot of the work. You know, both of your books really kind of connect to the work that we try to do. I'm reading Matt's book. It kind of took me back a little bit because a lot of my early research was national politics, was Democrats and Republicans, and the focus of my work is how do we have the tough conversations we need to have for democracy to work? And I got more and more frustrated with national politics and effective polarization. So instead of taking that on, I ran away. So I shifted my work from national to local when I got it to CSU 20 years ago. So the Center for Public Deliberation does a lot of this stuff, but we actually don't take on partisanship, right? We avoid it, right? We frame things as local issues. We don't want people to walk in, their identity is kind of, blue and red and so forth, right? But then we use a lot of these techniques. We train students. So any of the students here, if you're interested, we have dedicated coursework to train you as a facilitator. So a CPD event looks a little bit like this, but we have our students at every single table train generally and deliberation and conflict management and train specifically on that topic. So the CPD essentially serves as this impartial resource trying to help us have these conversations. And in particular, it's informed by communication theory, by argumentation, by conflict management, but also by social psychology, right? Because what we're learning is, unfortunately, our brains are much more wired for like polarization and outrage than they are naturally wired for deliberation and collaboration. But once we know that, once we understand these things, that's what we're learning from a lot of this work, then basically what the CPD is doing is using process design to hope to avoid triggering the worst of human nature and actually tap into the best of human nature. So what we do is to try to shift that people aren't seeing themselves as adversaries coming in. We switch from kind of an adversarial model to a collaborative model. We're creating discussion guides that spark the very conversation, really take on that misconception of the other side, right? Instead of relying on people expressing their opinion, at least at the table, we get that beforehand, and then we create a summary, which we're basically shifting. We're still certainly dealing with conflict, but we're dealing with the actual conflict rather than the perceived conflict, which is always much more manageable, right? So we help people kind of engage these tensions in much more productive ways. So I'll stop there, but certainly can jump back in.
Yeah, thanks, Martine. It was so fun to listen to Matt's presentation, in part because his advice at the end is basically all of the advice we give to our facilitators and to folks when we go out into the world and talk to them about how to talk about politics. I'd say my number one piece of advice is always like, stop talking about politicians so much, like talk about yourselves and about your lives. Like, we're giving politicians and folks who already have power too much power over our civic life. And democracy is about us, right? So when we talk about us, it becomes a lot easier to find those common bonds and to not get caught up in the arguments that folks are profiting off of, right? They're making a lot of money, they're gaining a lot of power by making us angry at each other. But when we kind of shift away from them and towards the things that matter in our own lives, it becomes a whole lot easier to make these connections and to actually create change in our communities. And the only other thing I wanted to add is that we're actually doing a lot of work to help communities really build that common bond as an entry level before you start doing civic work. So how do we create trust in our rural communities, in our classrooms? How do we create environments and opportunities for folks to share their experiences with one another, engage in that perspective getting and perspective taking and storytelling, and then ask them, all right, now what's an issue in your community that you need to work on or that you want to work on? And then they build bonds both through that storytelling and then through the work. Right? They don't need to consult with the parties to understand what's happening in their communities and what changes they want to see. They know those things, right? So I think sometimes it's about finding our own power and being confident that we are important in democracy. And some of this is just recentering the local, recentering ourselves in democracy, and trying not to get so caught up in the engine that is constantly trying to make us angry at one another.
Thank you so much, Katie and Martine. So diving back into polarization, I think it will be useful to start maybe thinking about why has it increased so much recently, right? So you talked about social identity as one of the things. Did it used to be the case that people's identities were not so attached to politics? Like you talked about social media. Social media are huge now, but were not as big 10 years ago, right? And like polarization was still increasing before. So like, what is it about, you know, the 90s and the early 2000s? What happened? How things have changed? Like, why did polarization grow so much?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things is something that people don't often, well, scholars think about, but for ordinary people, I think one of the big changes, so those of you who say, remember the Reagan administration, which is going to roll out many of the students, right? Think about the way in which you used to get a lot of news and information. Often it was from a local paper that often had quite a lot of, you know, local content and framed things on local issues. Exactly as we were, you know, just talking about a few minutes ago, right? Maybe you watch, you know, a short national, you know, kind of newscast. But that was sort of like a lot of the, part of it was that a lot of these issues were much more, you know, kind of local than national, right? There's a lot of classic political science work in the 70s and 80s about how congressional elections tended to be really dominated by a lot of local concerns, much more than national partisan concerns. And that's really changed, in part due to the decline of local media, which shifted for a lot of different reasons, right? Some of them technological, some of them dealing with kind of consolidation in the industry, right? Some of it being the rise of social media. But part of it is also that politicians realized it was sort of good for them to do these sorts of things, that this is a way of generating, right, conflict and consensus are ways of kind of like activating people and getting them interested in politics. And part of it is also just sort of a point where, for a variety of different kind of demographic and social challenges, that Americans are closely divided, even if it's not always deeply divided, right? So there's a good book by a scholar, Francis Lee, and I think one of the big insights there is that part of the reason why Congress is not the only reason, but one reason why it's so dysfunctional is that it's always the case that sort of one party, just a little bit more, right, can win, you know, can kind of take control of the next, you know, election. And then once you're the majority party, right, it turns out you get a lot, that comes with a lot of advantages, right? So it matters that, you know, Kevin McCarthy is now the one negotiating with Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden instead of what Nancy Pelosi said she was going to step down to now it'd be Hakeem Jeffries, right? That, if you're in control, right, that matters. So if, Mitch McConnell went back to being majority leader, right, then, judicial appointments wouldn't happen, right, anywhere near the same pace they are now. So because people perceive a lot of value in that, right, they go to great lengths to try and do that.
I'll just add one point in terms of why polarization is increasing, and I agree with all that. But there's there's always been forces that bring us together and forces that divide us. And I think what we're seeing is the forces that divide us have grown and grown, and the forces that bring us together have kind of withered. And a lot of things that used to bring us together have flipped sides, right? So we used to have, politics ends at the water's edge, right? That foreign policy would bring us together, not so much anymore, right? The media, when it used to be ABC, NBC, that you would get it, the media would be kind of a moderating kind of force. Now, so much media is politicized and speaking to their kind of individual choirs, and even sports, right? In some ways it brings it, but now sports is becoming a political issue. Like you saw the glee from some people that the women's World Cup team lost early, right? So I think as we think about depolarization, we always want to think about at least two big strategies. One is how can we lessen the powers that divide us, but then also how can we increase the powers that bring us together? And certainly focusing more on local, developing bridging institutions. I think you call them cross-cutting kind of social institutions in your book. Like we need those kind of organizations. We have so many partisan organizations, so many activist groups that are kind of bringing people in. To what degree do we have those organizations that their purpose is to bring people together? And we need to kind of rediscover and reinvigorate those.
So I'm fascinated with this work on partisan stereotypes, partisan misperceptions. And if you're one of my students, you don't get to shout out, but there's a few stats I always like to bring up. So like, if I were to ask you how many Republicans make $250,000 or more a year, like what percentage of Republicans make $250,000 or more, do you think? And somebody can say something, it costs nothing. 20%, somebody said 5. Anybody else?
2.
Yeah, it's 2, right? But when you ask Americans that question, they say 40%, right? Similar thing with the union, right? Like union membership, union households, right? If I kind of spent a lot of time in Detroit when we immigrated from Poland, that's where we lived. Lots of union households. Here, probably less so. If you ask people what percentage of Democrats belong to a labor union, anybody have a guess?
7.
So it is like 5. But people think it's close to half, right? So again, this is just one example of many misperceptions we have. And my question to Matt is it all media driven or like where else is this coming from? Because it seems like this is prevalent. We all have these pictures in our heads of what the other side looks like. It doesn't really seem very, very, very accurate. I get the motivations of cable news, but like by a pretty huge margin, most people don't watch cable news. So is it just media driven? Like where else is this coming from?
Yeah, great question. So some of these things reflect some basic sort of underlying psychological biases, right? That we tend to assume that people who are important to groups or important to a group, right, are typical of a group, right? So if you were to watch, the Democratic National Convention, right, next summer, right, you'll see speeches from, say, people seeking, who are labor advocates. You'll see, speeches from people who are, LGBT rights advocates, all of these sorts of things. And so people will go from like, oh, those groups are, sort of important to like they're typical of them, right? It's sort of lumped under the psychological name for this, like accessibility heuristic, right? Because they tend to be associated with something, we tend to assume that's who a lot of these groups are. Now, partly it's also that people are just, the fancy word for this is enumerate, that means bad at math, basically. So you can do things to try and help them, kind of balance out some of this, and it makes people better. But I think it's also that people have a hard time, like groups are really hard to understand. It's easy to understand who a Democrat is, really hard to understand who the Democratic Party is, right? Because it's lots of different people, lots of different groups. And so I think because that's a very hard problem, people tend to kind of simplify down to a simpler one of like, who are, people I associate with the Democratic Party, and assuming that it must kind of, scale up from there, right? So the one of the papers that Dom's drawing on there is this one from Doug Ehler and Gaurav Sood, and they have this stat in there that the modal member of both parties is a white, middle-aged, non-born-again Christian, and that always blows students' minds that they like refuse to believe it. But yes, that is in fact who the modal member of both parties is.
So when Matt was talking about some of our work, I hope this isn't going to explode. We were bringing people together across Philly. We even took an Uber to the Jersey Shore once. The Uber driver wasn't very happy about that.
He made a lot of money though.
He made a lot of money. But these things were fun to put together. I think people had a good time, and obviously we have evidence that there's a positive effect of these things. But a lot of people wouldn't want to participate in these things, right? We had a hard time recruiting, even though we paid people to participate. A lot of people don't want to talk about politics because they perceive this as something that's just going to bring them discomfort and all kinds of other things. So we talked about this a lot, but this is really a question to everybody is like, how do we scale these things, right? So these things seem to work. Some people are never going to participate in these things. Like, is there a way to make these things more appealing? Is there a way to scale any of these things to kind of make it meaningful at scale?
Great question. So the way I think about this is that the solution isn't to get everyone to like come do one of these events, right? It's to think about how to give people a set of skills to have these conversations in their everyday life. So this is less about, having people like come to some event sponsored by some group, and if you want to do that, that's great. But helping people learn how to have better conversations, right? Across lots of different kinds of difference. So right, partisanship is the one we're talking about here, right? But there are lots of other different kinds of divides we might imagine, some of which intersect with partisanship, some of which don't. And so I think it's about helping people learn to have good conversations, right, that they can use kind of generally in their lives, right? And that's right, there are some people, this isn't going to work. Some people like being polarized, some people like, sort of feeling angry towards the other side, and that it is what it is, right? So, when I work with different groups, I always say like, work with the people that you can work with. And I think that's why I sort of say like, start small, start with these conversations, like look for these other strategies to maybe kind of decenter some of these more controversial things, build up from some of these other bonds, and try and do some of those sort of things at a smaller scale. I think that's likely to give you a bigger payoff in terms of thinking about scaling, right, than trying to do things that are, like, oh, everyone needs to do this one thing or something like that.
Yeah, I agree. And as much as I was kind of like, we're giving folks in power too much power, I think part of it is developing our local leadership so that if we have strong local leaders who are connected to the community, if we have lots of them, right, then we have a strong bench of folks that can move up to the national level and who have done so through working with their community across difference about tough issues that matter to folks' lives. So we've actually, I work on a program in high schools where we're training young people to be civic leaders in their own communities. We're working with rural communities to develop the civic capacity in rural communities. Often their governments face unique challenges of scale. So how do we harness the resources that they have and help them create strong leadership that will build up? So I very much agree. It's not that everybody needs to come to a Center for Public Deliberation event. It's that we need to have democracy and these types of conversations in civic life more embedded in our lives. So what does democracy look like in our workplace? What are the civic issues that impact us as a work community? What does democracy look like in our organizational life, right? It's about recentering us in the work and our communities in the work so that it's not everybody doing the same thing all at once. And it's also not that voting is not important. I hope everybody in this room is registered to vote and that you all have plans to vote, right? But it's that democracy is not a one-day thing. It needs to be a part of our civic fabric that we're constantly practicing. Like when we host events, the first thing that we do is start with discussion guidelines, and it's teaching people, how do you have a conversation about civics that does not implode? Because all of their examples are people screaming at each other. So the more we can provide opportunities for folks to have low stakes, easy conversations, work together on issues in their communities, right? It's not a one-time thing. It's an everyday practice of being or trying to be our best civic selves to one another.
Yeah, I've said for about 10 years now, I've been making this argument often at the beginning of my talks that, one of the biggest questions I think for this country or for democracy kind of generally is this like hyper polarization and adversarial framework from the national going to keep on bleeding down, or are a lot of these really cool innovative things that are happening in local communities going to start kind of making its way up, right? And our goal is very much how do we kind of avoid the former and really kind of help the latter, because mentioned already in terms of working with high schools, we work with trying to kind of reimagine local journalism. We have a new project called the Deliberative Journalism Project to see if local newspapers, which are struggling on their own right, can now be kind of forces for democracy and kind of bring us together. We work with libraries, which are great civic spaces. We work with community foundations. We work a lot with cities. So people ask me often when we talk about what we're doing in CBD, like, how can that transfer to national? And there's not an easy question to it, right? Changing national politics is a much more difficult thing. There's a lot more money and resources for the adversarial model than the deliberative model. But the more and more we get individual communities doing it differently, because I think a big part of the CBD story is people enjoy it, right? At the end of these events, they're exhausted. We made their brains work differently, but they know they did something important. And I think there is a yearning for genuine conversation. So the more we give people that alternative, they see there's an alternative, and I think they'll start demanding it more, right? So how do we kind of keep on building on that and all these different avenues that we've been mentioning?
I do have one more note. There are a lot of large-scale deliberative programs. If you haven't heard of the Irish Constitutional Convention, it's a really great example of deliberative change happening at the national level. But those are usually a result of folks trying something at the local level and then it gradually making its way up the political process. So there are lots of ways that we can restructure our large-scale civic institutions to be more deliberative, to be more bridging rather than divisive. So there are ways to change the ways we've been doing things, but I think it often requires experimentation at the local level, like changing to ranked choice voting and things like that to see what's possible, and then we can scale it up and out.
Yeah, and British Columbia also did a deliberative electoral reform kind of event. This was good transition, Martine, because you mentioned escaping national politics, and Matt, your esteemed colleague Dan Hopkins wrote a book on nationalization of our politics. And what seems to be happening recently is there's a lot of culture war, those identitarian polarizing issues are kind of trickling down to the local level. There's a lot of groups that are kind of astroturfing and very much driven by kind of national culture war issues like Moms for Liberty, that kind of stuff. People running for school boards, etc., that are primarily not driven by any really local considerations, but it's all kind of response to kind of the nationalization of politics, etc. So in the context of these culture war, polarizing, identity-based issues, what can we do? Right? It seems like local used to be an escape. It doesn't seem like it can be anymore. Is there something that can be done with these techniques, with the process of nationalizing of our politics?
Yeah, I realize I'm saying everyone's a good question, so it's a bad question, mostly because it's so hard to answer. No, there's no easy answer to that. Unfortunately, I mean, I think sometimes what I say to people in those cases is to try and, break out of these things. So I'm going to tell a small story about the high school that I went to. So the Moms for Liberty just tried to ban a set of books from the library, and a lot of them were focused on LGBT issues. But it turned out that when the librarian made their presentation, so I was following because my parents still live in the same place where I grew up. No one had ever checked any of those books out of the library. So it was all just this kind of purely hypothetical, like very kind of astroturf thing. It wasn't like someone had actually like gone and like read this and like was offended by it. It was just like, it was like this hypothetical thing that could have happened. So I think trying to bring people back to like the actual concerns and the actual sorts of debates is like a way of kind of trying to recenter on these sorts of things and say like, well, what are we actually, you know, sort of debating about there, and trying to lead things into, you know, that. But it is very hard because there is, you know, a lot of stuff like these are, you know, astroturf groups with a lot of money behind them, so they're definitely pushing there, which is why I think it's important for everyone to kind of try and push back and resist that tide a little bit.
One thing I'm struggling with, so I'm going to turn this into a question. I'd be curious, kind of anyone kind of dig into. This goes back a little bit to you talking about kind of, you know, managing civility kind of to a point, right? Because it is clear, and you mentioned this as well, that we do seem to have more and more bad faith actors. I like Amanda Ripley's term, conflict entrepreneurs, right? People, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of my work is, you know, using social psychology to design process to avoid triggering the worst of human nature and actually tap into the best. But there's a lot of people getting really, really rich, like you said, doing the opposite, right? That know the quirks of human nature and are taking advantage of them. So I see those as kind of bad faith actors. But I struggle with this one thing, because one is I know I need to adjust my processes to account for bad faith actors, right? But then I also know part of our brain science is we like to assume that people that disagree with us are bad faith actors, right? Because then if we assume they have bad motives, we can just dismiss them, right? So I have these two contradictory things of, you know, so that line that you kind of mentioned of like, you know, do civility unless they've shown you bad faith. Well, it's really easy for us to get to the point of, oh, they're just in bad faith, right? So that's just one thing I'm struggling with, you know, so these astroturf groups, right? If we just kind of assume from the beginning, they're just bad faith actors with bad motives, therefore we should just dismiss them. I don't know pragmatically long-term if that works, right? You know, so I don't have an answer to that yet, but that's just something I'm struggling with is what's the right tactic for a bad faith actor, and maybe put that into quotes, because, you know, are they actually bad faith actors, or is that my brain wanting them to be? Right. I'd love any thoughts on that.
You have a solution, Katie?
I don't have a solution to that one.
Yeah, we talked about it.
No, I think one of the things that I try to keep in mind is like, is this right for, and we talk about this a lot, is this right for deliberation? Where in the decision-making point are we, right? What is it that we are actually trying to decide on here? One thing that I think is important to keep in mind when we are talking across difference is there's a difference between disagreeing on how to solve a problem and dehumanizing someone else, right? And what we can do is say, you are not allowed to invalidate somebody else's experiences, right? That doesn't mean that you don't get to disagree on how we create a policy solution, but you can't say this person doesn't have a right to exist. It's that strong civility thing, right? Like, we have to acknowledge that that other person is a human who has thoughts and feelings, and their voice should be as valued as our voices in this conversation. If we are not at a place where we're both acknowledging the humanity in one another, then we have to do that work before we can jump into a policy disagreement, right? Because if I don't acknowledge your right to exist, then I'm not going to value your position on this policy. So sometimes we have to start a little bit earlier on, right? And we can't always do that. And sometimes we're trying to make a decision on the fly. But the more we can build those opportunities for connection and community across difference, the easier it is later on when we are tackled with a tough issue that pits two groups against one another, right? We are not always going to find a solution that solves all of our problems and that everyone is satisfied with, and that shouldn't be our goal. But our goal should be talking together, learning from one another, so that we can come up with a solution that acknowledges the impacts that something will have on somebody else, and we're okay with that at the end of the day. But we have to first accept the humanity in other people before we can move into these more difficult issues.
Add one quick thing to it. She just set me up really well. So I was rereading your book this morning, kind of looking through my notes. And at the beginning of chapter 4, you have a quote from Thomas Jefferson. I never considered a difference of opinion in politics and religion and philosophy as cause for withdrawing from a friend, right? But that made me think of James Baldwin's quote, which is you were kind of getting at, right? That we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and a denial of my humanity and right that exists, right? And I've had that sent to me at times because the CBD serves as an impartial resource, but then there's this tough thing of like, are we always, we're not neutral, it's like we don't have values. And we are partisan towards democracy, small d democracy, and we're partisan towards good information, which we haven't talked about misinformation yet and how this weaves through all this as well. But there's some really tough things to negotiate there, right? On some of these lines that are coming up that we're still trying to figure out.
No, exactly. And as Katie says, right, that kind of language in the long term then opens the door for acts of violence and other things that we've seen in different places in this country and a lot of scholars are concerned about. So I'm thinking I'll ask one more, then maybe if Martine and Katie have any questions, I'll let you ask those, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you. And the question is, there is like some scholars who maybe think that polarization is overstated a bit. And I know you've shown in some of your previous work that the perceptions of polarization themselves matter, right? So we think we're polarized and that has effects. I think a lot of people who think that maybe we're not as polarized as we think we are, kind of rooted in idea that most people are like by a pretty huge margin are pretty uninterested in politics. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are there in terms of is it really as big of a deal as some kind of in the public sphere make it out to be? And we even had a question here about like, are there any positives to polarization? So I'll pitch that to you.
Great. Okay, there we go. So actually, I just want to say one kind of quick thing on that last question before I answer this one. So I get variations of the question a lot when I talk to these other groups, and sometimes one of the things I've said to people is that sometimes you might have to have an uncomfortable conversation with someone where I hesitate to use this word because it's come to take on a different meaning, but you almost kind of have to call them out on some of these things. And, I think like the strategy I might try to use if I were in this situation with, some of these things is just sort of say like, you might not be comfortable with LGBT, people, but they have a right to exist. They have a right to like know things about themselves and to learn that information in a kind of safe space. And you have to kind of respect that. And, kind of remind them of those sorts of things. And look, not everyone's going to buy that. But I think at that point, once you know that they're not willing to do that, then I think you sort of have good evidence that they're a bad faith actor at that point. So then to answer the last question that Dom asked, there's a lot of debates over this in the literature about, should we care about polarization? Should we care about, something else, where there's something else is a wide variety of other outcomes, right? And there's lots of things that people can probably spend their time, doing. And I think one nice thing about academia is I've always sort of been a proponent of like let 1,000 flowers bloom. And there's people who are going to work on lots of different things. And if you're familiar with the 20th century rhetorical critic Kenneth Burke, he has this idea of perspective via incongruity, that sometimes you take two things that don't seem like they should fit together, they can actually show you something really new and kind of interesting. So, sometimes you can even, that's why I say like, do lots of stuff that might seem weird, because it might kind of turn out to be something that gives you some new insight. So to me, the question isn't, like I think polarization is an interesting and important thing to think about, because division and consensus then falls over into so many other things. But I don't think of it as an end in and of itself. It's about something that we're trying to do things that are, better, to make government function more effectively, to help people more fully realize their preferences into government. So to me, that's the end goal. And the reason I care about polarization is because I think it prevents us from doing things like that. So I think it's important to the extent that, it prevents us from doing those sorts of things. So that's why I think it's important to think about or to talk about or to research and study.
Yeah, this is another, you start seeing how my brain works, right? My brain looks for the tensions and kind of leans into them So that's one of the other tensions I deal with. I mean, I do make the argument that I think polarization is basically our number one issue, right? Because as an engagement person, as a communication person, when we're polarized, we can't talk and facts don't work, and so it just kind of undermines everything. But I also agree with you, and your research shows this, that polarization is really exaggerated, right? But the reality is the perception of polarization is the impact. But then there's a third, particularly a lot of my academic friends will argue polarization isn't the issue, right? It's more, well, a lot of them will say the GOP is the issue, right? And then other people might say, no, the left has gone too far extreme and so forth. And I might agree with some of those arguments, but ultimately I'm a pragmatist, right? And I think if we don't take on polarization first, then I don't think we're going to get to some of those other issues, right? So even if the polarization is more one fault than the other, people are concerned that if we focus on polarization, we're kind of doing a both sidesism, or we're saying kind of both sides are doing it when they believe one side's doing it more than the other. Well, I think we're going to have to take on polarization first. And if we're able to do that, right? Because what happens when polarization goes down and the quality of conversation goes up, then the quality of the argument matters more, right? In my view, if the world is really dominated now by powerful people purposely oppressing people and holding them down, I think they love it that we're all screaming at each other and facts don't matter. It makes it really easy for them to keep on doing it. But as we start changing our conversations and elevating them, then I think we start, being able to kind of expose that kind of bad behavior, undemocratic behavior, and hopefully kind of move forward.
I do have a question. I'm stealing it a little bit from our team because we've been emailing about this internally. But I am interested to hear what you think are the other big problems. I know that we had discussed like rising authoritarianism tendencies as one of the kind of other things that's happening. Misinformation is another thing that is happening, and they're all obviously tied together. But I'd love to hear your insights into the relationship between those three concepts. Small question.
Yeah, very small, very easy to answer quickly. Yeah, no, I mean, it's tricky, right? So I think that so a couple of things that just kind of popped to mind. So one thing that I will say is that I think what we've learned from doing a bunch of these studies into like support for backsliding, which are like basically kind of like excusing when your side breaks the rules, right? A lot of what we've learned from that is that, yeah, voters matter to that process, but it's a lot more elite driven, right? And that's really the key thing. And that a lot of this democracy rots from the top, in the words of Larry Bartels, that political science just published a new book looking at European democracies, sort of saying that. And I think that, that's probably right, that that if we want to think about democratic backsliding, right, certain, political leaders are more to blame than kind of ordinary voters. And, the same thing is sort of true of a lot of the misinformation, that we focus a lot on the, kind of demand side about, like, so if you read, and there is by no means a criticism, there's this great, kind of portrait of studies by these people who worked with Facebook and Instagram in 2020 to do all this stuff, but it was all about like, well, could we like make a small tweak to see if people will do less of this? But a lot of this is the supply of these sorts of things, as people are doing those things. But I think that like we have to focus on these mass level strategies, but there's also a lot on those elite level strategies as well. But unfortunately, I do not have any good strategies for the elite level, nor does anyone else, because I went to a conference with a lot of very smart people, and I produced a book called How Can We Reduce Polarization? And I say this liking every single person in the book. It has not one useful strategy in it, and it's like 300 pages long. I think the person who put it together would probably be mad if I said that, but I've told that to many of the people in the book, and they're like, yeah, we know. So, like that's why I think I tend to sort of focus on the more kind of applied things, but there's definitely like a big elite angle to it. I just don't have any great solutions for that one.
So we simply need better elites. So if anybody has ideas, run for office. Any other questions? Okay, so I think we'll open it up to, I'm gonna stand up in front of the owl. No, so anybody have any questions for our panelists, for Matt, for anybody else? Yes.
Okay, so it's Katie, right?
Yes.
You talked about, community and, coming together and cultivating local leadership to rise to the top. I'm totally for that, and it's one of the things I like about Martine's forums is that they bring people together, although the demographics are kind of usually the same. So I don't know how we can, diversify it. But one of the things that I find that's rather difficult is local people running for politics. For example, we have a current opening in District 52, and the one person has raised 30,000 already, and the one following behind her is 12. And the third one, who was a millennial, a graduate from CSU, was in the military, is a public servant. He was very disheartened and he didn't run. And I'm hoping that he will the next time around. I said, get involved in local issues and, get familiar with people and so that they know you. So we have money as an issue because, for example, our current state treasurer, Dave Young, needed over $2 million to run a re-election campaign. I know the man. He's a decent human being, an ex-teacher. That's incredible. I mean, even at the local level, who can come up with these thousands of dollars? And the other thing, once they get into office, with all of this polarization going on, could it be that maybe you were voted in by these people, but now you have to go through this forced rotation throughout the state, so that way you get to know these other people who feel like they don't have a voice, and that's why they voted for the guy that's like not being very nice, you know what I'm saying? And the other challenge I think is getting faces of diversity. You said who the average person was. I'm not seeing faces of diversity in there. So I don't know what you think about forced rotation and money. I don't know how we can overcome that.
Yes, let's solve money in politics really quickly.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. We've actually been having a lot of conversations internally at CSU. We are doing so many amazing civic engagement programs across the state, but thinking about how do we link them together. So for example, the legislative internship program with our rural communities or with our young folks in the high schools. So can we help bridge those connections between our elected officials and our community leaders? There's also been legislative training programs that specifically work with state legislatures, and Martine's done a lot of work with government officials and providing these trainings for them. I think we often assume that we all know how to engage the community, but it actually takes a specific set of skills. A lot of it's project management, frankly, a lot of it's thinking through who your stakeholders are and how do you recruit those diverse stakeholders so that you are hearing from across your community. One of the things that we think about when we are doing our stakeholder analysis is who is most impacted by this, right? So it's not, sometimes it's who has the most to say, but like who is impacted that we don't hear from, and then we recruit and target those communities explicitly and pretty intensely. It doesn't always work, and it's something that I think we are constantly trying to do better, but it's imperative on us as local organizers to put the onus on ourselves to do better and to try to, like, where there are folks already doing the work of representing underrepresented or under-recognized communities, how do we bring them into the decision-making process and serve as a connector with the folks who do have the power and build those pathways for leadership? Money in politics, I don't have a great answer for, other than I'm for severe campaign limits, so.
Yeah, just kind of two thoughts. So I got to be part of this group where we talked to people from one of the parties about what to do. And my pitch to them was, instead of putting so much money into fundraising for kind of candidates, especially ones that had very little shot of winning, you'll be able to tell which party this was in a minute. That you should try to build up more, put money into organizing to develop these kind of community skills and do more. And they completely ignored it and then did more to develop their internal fundraising structure. The second thing that I would say is to think about like hearing from stakeholders. I'm going to use someone who might seem like a weird example, but I think actually is a good model, and it's one I like to talk with about my students. And it's actually Hillary Clinton. And when she was the senator of New York, one of the very first things she did was she undertook a listening tour where she went to every one of the 62 counties in the state of New York and met with people and heard about her concerns. And so she's talked about it publicly a lot. And, you know, she said in a lot of these communities, what she first got was frankly just people yelling at her, right? Because they assumed that she didn't understand them, would never understand them. But she, you know, showed up and kind of did the work. And over time, they came to grow and trust her. And I think those sorts of things about like building out, like listening and showing people that you actually can respond to their concerns is like an important part of it. I mean, my pitch for why we should take money out of politics is even aside from all the corrupting influences, it takes so much time. So if any of you have ever interned on DC, there's a huge building that's right across from the Capitol. Does anyone know what it's used for? Exactly. You know, if you're a political science professor, you're not allowed to answer these random questions. I heard you in the back. So yes, it's owned. Whoever bought that building a long time ago has done very well because they lease. It's horrible office space. They lease it to the DNC and RNC. So by federal rules, you can't use your congressional office to raise money. So you walk across the street and you sit in literally a cubicle and you call people and ask them for money. And that's what members of Congress do for 4 or 5 hours a day. It's truly, I mean, it's awful. Like I can't, like literally you could not pay me enough money to do that. But you know, that to me is why, like, that is the argument for doing it is like, that doesn't help anyone, right? I mean, I guess the people it helps are the people that produce TV ads, and it helps local TV stations, and we pay them a lot of money to run those ads. But no one else benefits from the system. I guess campaign consultants benefit from it too. None of those groups are groups I'm interested in helping, right? But instead of doing things like getting to your constituents, learning about issues, that's what members spend a lot of time doing. So I think that's actually the real reason to say like we should limit. That's my practical reason why we should limit money in politics.
Wait, more question. There's one in the back. I'll walk there. Sure. So in the meantime, just imagine like elevator music as I'm walking to Dr. Harris.
So it seems that overcoming polarization is a common endeavor, right? Everyone has to participate for it to work, but the costs of polarization are diffused, right? We all suffer those. And the benefits, though, seem to be concentrated in a few people who love it. And not just these elites, but we all know people who are kind of rabid one side or the other, and they enjoy it. I think you said that earlier, saying consumption good for some of these people. They find community, they find common bonds with other kind of rabid people on the left and the right. What are the individual level incentives to bother participating in this common project?
And you now have about 20 seconds to think of your answer.
Yeah, so interesting question. I mean, I don't have a great answer beyond like, this is in a way kind of thinking about what it means to be a citizen, right, in a democracy. And so, you know, sometimes I talk to students, they'll say like, oh, well, you know, like we could do this all with anarchy. As someone who, my office is next to people that work for a USAID project in Somalia where you have to be driven around, and that's basically like as close as you can get to anarchy kind of currently, maybe the DRC. But, you know, like that's not really a good thing. That like democracy has like a lot of value, you know, it has a lot of value, but it requires us to kind of be, it requires us to be present and to be active. I don't think there's like a great, I don't have a great, you know, sort of thing to say like, oh, your life is going to get like much better beyond like better decision making is good for, you know, all of us. I think a challenge of the 21st century is you know, is present by my sister says this conflict between democracy and autocracy. And I think, you know, kind of reaffirming some of the values of democracy, like, is an important challenge for all of us.
And as somebody who was born in a non-democratic country, I think being in a democratic country absolutely rocks compared to not being in a democratic country. Like, not seeing tanks on the street is pretty cool, if you ask me. Anybody else that responds to that?
Do you support seeing tanks?
I don't support tanks in the streets. No, I will say, actually, one of the things we've been trying to do, and I do want to give a shout out to Sabrina Slagowski-Tipton, our managing director, who has done so much work with us on building these institutions. But one of the things that she and I have really focused on is we actually like try to pay community members when they are doing intense civic work, right? I get paid for this work. City engagement officials get paid for this work. Nonprofit folks get paid for this work. I think that there's a way to redistribute our resources a little bit so that we are acknowledging the work that democracy takes and that we are funding it. So I think sometimes we actually just do need to pay people to do the hard organizing work of democracy. The other thing, though, is that, like, you know, it can be fun and it feels really good. It's a little bit like working out. Like, you don't always want to, like, you sometimes want to eat a bucket of ice cream instead of working out, but you're going to feel better after working out. I feel the same way about the civic work that we do, right? Sometimes it's fun to be angry and it can be politically helpful to be angry, right? But let's be angry at the right people and at the right things instead of at our family members, right? Because it doesn't feel good to stop talking to your brother or your uncle or your sister because you hold different political identities. So I do think that there is something about, like, the more you do it, the more you like it. Our students keep coming back to this work because it is fulfilling and it makes you feel good about yourself and the work that you're doing out in the world.
Yeah, I do think, while I think going back to the why polarization increase, I think the other part of it is polarization leads to more polarization, right? You capture that. There is this vicious cycle, this negative feedback loop. But we've also, I think we found in our work that there's also the opposite. There's a virtuous cycle, that the more you do this, the easier it is to do. You know, I do think a lot of, for me, I go back to social psychology. But once we understand how our brain's wired, that our brain wants simple, right? That our brain wants good versus evil and so forth, hopefully we get inoculated against it a little bit, right? So to get back to that question, I think once we realize, so then that person that has the simple story that's screaming it, they seem out of place, right? So then I think there gets to be, I guess, some positives, some joy of knowing kind of you're engaging things in the way we need to engage it, right? And I think while a lot of those negative aspects of human nature are more natural and stronger, there are some positive aspects of human nature that we can tap into. Humans are great creative problem solvers when asked to be. We actually have a lot in common in terms of being social beings, of wanting to connect it, right? So how do we figure it out that it can't always just be you're eating your vegetables to do democracy. I think there's ways we can find it that people are actually getting joy and a sense of satisfaction when they have the kind of conversations they need to have.
Democracy flavored ice cream. Okay, so this time, I'll run around the room for a bit. I'll collect like 3 questions, so you guys pay attention. So who's questions? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, in that order. Yes.
This might be a question more for you two, since you're communications professors, but I've gotten into my fair share of shouting matches on social media when it comes to politics. And I wonder, is there any way to, what you talked about civility when asking someone about their ideals, is how do you treat it when somebody comes to you, shouting at you, asking all these questions? How do you kind of keep it civil and keep it low key?
Great. So remember this question. Very good.
Hi, I had the privilege of taking Post 302 in my undergrad, U.S. Political Parties and Elections. And it was one of my favorite courses. And there's 7 qualities of a good electoral system, 2 of those being stable and effective, but also being oppositional. How do those things work together when you do have a system that requires there to be 2 different parties for you to choose from? I think my solution would be proportional representation, but, how would these two things work together when you need both of those things against each other at the same time?
So electoral systems, and question number 3. Hi there. So earlier in the talk, you had posed the question of how polarization was different between the 1990s and early 2000s and now. And I think the easy answer would involve 9/11 taking us out of a relatively peaceful and economically stable point in time to a time of widespread war and economic instability. But also, I think there's another answer in the presence of demagogues like Donald Trump in 2015, 2016, as really starting to like widen the trenches of polarization between the two sides. And I just wanted to pose the question of how the presence of demagogues and other kind of populist leaders or thought leaders, how it affects the process of hyperpartisanship. Very good. I'm sorry for like staring at you from close proximity. Yes.
Great, so let's take those in order. The first one, it's really hard, right? I mean, I think a lot of what we've learned is to the extent possible, I think trying to take things off of social media where conversations often aren't helpful is one strategy. But if you want to do it on there, I think trying to model the types of things that aren't there, right? That to ask questions about like, okay, well, why do you feel that way? Or why is that like important to you? And trying to reframe it instead of like having it be about getting angry at the person, about trying to maybe understand them a little bit better might be one, that would be the way I might try to approach it. But that's why I think trying to take it off of that is a way that maybe might be more effective. So kind of shifting it to something not on there. I think that's where like the kind of short format, like also you don't have a lot of room for kind of, like nuance and explanation. And the second question on, kind of the role of parties, what I tell people is I want to get to what Russell Muirhead, who's a political theorist, calls high partisanship. What does he mean by that? It's about that there are hard choices that have to be made in a political system. And so what partisanship ideally would do is help us understand what those choices are, right? Like there are a lot of policy choices we're going to have to make over the coming decades to understand how to solve, the climate crisis, to address, legacies of slavery and racism, right? To, empower parents and educators to be, ensure that everyone receives a good education. Like these are hard challenges that require real solutions, right? And so ideally what partisanship can try to do is to help us move towards an understanding of like, well, what are those choices and how do we make choices between these, two sides on these important issues rather than just sort of, more kind of petty squabbling. And the last question on demagoguery, it's a tough one, right? That you have some of these leaders, and I'll in a very professorial move answer it by not answering it, but just giving my own question, which is sort of thinking. Sorry, that's what professors like to do. So I think I might rephrase, maybe rather than asking another question, I'll rephrase it a little bit. And my advice to people is this: like, if anyone tells you that they alone can fix something, or they're, the famous, Louis XIV's "Après moi le déluge," after me it all goes to hell. You should always be really skeptical of that. There are very few people, where that's really sort of true. And I say more than putting your faith in people, put your faith in institutions and processes. And so it's important to have good institutions and processes, because it shouldn't be about individual people. It should be about having good structures that allow things to function effectively, right, regardless of who is actually there.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think Argentina's constitution was more or less copy-pasted American constitution, like 80% of it, but outcomes were very different due to norms and some other institutional structures that were in place. Just to add to what Professor Levendusky said, anything to add on the 3 questions, Martine and Katie?
Yeah, I think the modeling good behavior on social media, when I have seen like a tide turn on social media, it's because someone in the thread was being genuinely curious, right? Like, I really want to understand why you feel that way. If the person is just trolling and name calling, walk away. Like, don't feed them. They are looking for your anger. I am not a social media user in this way, in part because it is not built to foster good conversations. It's asynchronous and you have no obligation to respond to the person or treat them like a human, right? And so it is not set up in a way to foster good conversation. So I think acknowledging that going into it, being curious, but then being very comfortable, walk away. I teach my students to call out, call in, or walk away. And there are a lot of different reasons why you might do one of those things. But sometimes the answer is just to leave the conversation. And then I agree, there's going to be winners and losers in every system. Partially, it's about making it so that not all our only choice isn't, am I voting for a Democrat or a Republican? And we start to develop nuanced positions on all of the many difficult choices that we're going to have to face over the coming years, right? So that we are involved in that decision making throughout, and that it's not just opposition at the point of voting, but we all have different positions and perspectives about how to solve this. But I'm going to make a smarter decision if I listen to all of those perspectives before making a decision.
Yeah, I think the go-to first was the call in, right? If you're trying to deal with that publicly, so I've done that a lot, that I'll send them a private message and have a different kind of conversation, right? But the idea of, I've done quite a few of those Thanksgiving radio shows of like, how do I talk to the relatives? And it's funny because there's some of my relatives I can't talk to. But if you're going in with the goal of converting them, of changing their mind, you're always going to fail, and it's probably going to backfire, right? If you go in with just wanting to understand them, right, and you're truly curious, I'll recommend one. Monica Guzman, who works for Braver Angels, has a new book called "I Never Thought of It That Way." Has a great TED talk about kind of how curiosity will save us. That might be something good for you, because she really kind of talks about it in a sense. Okay, what are these strategies for us to open up those conversations and have? But yeah, social media is not designed for it. For the second one, I'll go back to the goal that the work that we're doing. We're not trying to find consensus. We're not trying to assume we all agree. We know conflict is inherent in democracy. In diverse democracy, different people. A lot of y'all have heard me talk about wicked problems, kind of in that context. So our goal isn't to not be oppositional. Our goal is to actually argue about the things we disagree with, right? Not this caricature, this false assumption. So if we switch from the false conflict to the actual conflict. So I would love for elections to actually be on kind of true differences of opinion on issues. They just tend not to be, because those aren't what people get people out to vote. And the last thing, I've been seeing 9/11 be a kind of key historical thing in polarization, kind of in my view. I'll see just the growth of cable, and then the internet, right, which kind of turned media from more kind of neutral to more partisan. So Rush Limbaugh kind of showed the first way to do it on radio, and then Fox News kind of took the ball and run with it. I see that bit. And then you have changes in how Congress worked, particularly Newt Gingrich's strategies, which saw the advantage of polarization to get election. So those are some of the big historical things that I saw that really kind of seemed to be markers. And you had more and more. One book I've seen called The Polarizers, right? It just became a strategy, right? Polarizing was a very effective electoral strategy and a very effective bringing eyeballs and bringing clicks and getting rich strategy, which just has blown up in the last 20 years. It wasn't available for that.
Great. Okay. Last three, probably. We have room for last three. Okay. 1, 2, 3. That's easy enough. It seems like you guys generally have a consensus that social media, rise of cable, have polarized and made things worse. And you've described some things that can be done to bring people back together. I guess my question is, what keeps them from going back to those sources, repolarizing? I guess just what chance do they stand against all of the things coming at them all the time?
So my question is we've talked a lot about consensus, but I've also heard like the idea like consensus is just the absence of leadership. And with like the fast-paced changing environment, society and world we live in now, like not everyone is going to be informed and knowledgeable about most issues, to be honest. So how do we make those decisions when we just need leadership in areas like environmental policy or social media regulation? And how do we decide when it needs to be like general consensus?
What was the third one?
Yes.
All right, so my question is it possible to use some kind of like economic punishment to get the media to publish depolarizing or more accurate information on these articles that they publish? And if so, would it make it polarization worse before it gets better, or would it make it better?
Thanks. If we're in China, it would probably be super easy, but yeah, so I'll take those in turning. So the first one about social media, and when I talk about this with groups, and the other thing I say to them is that like I ask people to reflect on whether or not they actually genuinely feel better informed about these issues and topics, right? Because of things like social media, right? Not that you feel, more engaged, but you feel more informed, right? Because I don't admittedly spend a lot of time on social media because I find it very maddening, but I don't feel like there's a lot of actual information out there, right? There's a lot of people giving their perspective, right? And that can potentially in some cases be valuable, but I sometimes encourage people to think about it more for what it was initially designed to do, which is connecting with people on other things. On the second question about finding leadership, I think that yes, there's this sort of long debate in political science, right, and kind of public administration about like how much should we kind of delegate versus basically write kind of narrow laws that leave bureaucracies a lot of room versus give things very specifically. And so there's not an easy answer, but I think the thing that I'll say is that there's a lot of value in getting buy-in from things. So people will be much more willing to make some of the hard sacrifices that will have to be made on things like climate change if they buy in and kind of understand like why we're all moving in the same direction together. On the third strategy about how to change the media, it's very tough. I don't think that I don't have any great solutions. But one thing that I sort of try to say when I talk to kind of large heterogeneous groups is that sometimes you can walk away from some of these things maybe feeling a little bit depressed. But I think, and sometimes I feel depressed too. But the thing that I try to remind myself is that like there are, there's this old line from Fred Rogers, right, Mr. Rogers, right, who said, look for the helpers. And I try to keep that in mind, that there are people doing good work and good things, and that's sort of what this, kind of takes, is like a lot of kind of small steps. I don't think there's any like one, again, there's no magic solution to making things better. It just takes a lot of small efforts to try and slowly kind of change these sorts of things.
And I'll just add on the last one, it's very hard to be a free society and regulate media in any way, right? It's almost like one or the other. And even in countries that have tried and their intentions were good, like Germany had a fake news law that passed in 2018. A lot of NGOs and scholars and groups view it as fairly authoritarian because somebody at some point decides who gets to say what, right? So it's a very, very difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah, I think in terms of do they keep the good behavior going? My own research has shown mixed results. I've interviewed folks years after an intensive deliberative experience, and for some of them, like just hearing those discussion guidelines, they will tell other people discussion guidelines. They shift the ways that they have their own conversations. They read ballot measures more carefully, whatever it is. So for some folks, they're developing skills through these discursive processes, and then they can go apply those skills pretty easily outside of that context. we also have the same experience from the exact same process. They deliberated about a local ballot measure. And when they were kind of doing one of the first years, they were doing a tour around the state so that the folks who deliberated could tell other folks what they learned. And they almost immediately, when they got up on stage, started advocating in one way or another, which was totally antithetical to what they had been doing the entire time they've been deliberating. So I think that there is it's hard to get out of the norm of doing things when we do have a political structure that works so hard against so many of these things. And then the question about climate and leadership, I think one of the things that we're really struggling with is identifying whether something is a scientific issue, a socio-scientific issue, or a cultural issue. And those are all going to demand different things from us and different types of leadership and types of decision making. There are times when we should be able to say something like, climate change is real, and that not be controversial, and we can move forward with that. And honestly, that's one of the decisions we have made internally, is if we're going to host something about sustainability with the city, we're not hosting a debate about whether or not climate change exists. So I think part of that leadership is, where do you decide that decision is taking place, and not letting it get off track by starting it at a point of nonsense, but just saying, like, we're going to start with these set of facts that we can agree on, that are well-established, well-researched, and that's the framework with which we're going to work. But that's not true for all issues, and some issues are simply more cultural or values-based than others.
I think I'll primarily jump on the leadership one, because I've done some different leadership programs trying to apply the work that we do. And one construct, I think I can do this pretty quickly. You can kind of think of at least two different styles of leader, like the strong leader, I've got a strong opinion, I've got charisma, I can rally people and mobilize to a problem. In best case scenario, that's critical, but the line between that strong leader and a demagogue is pretty fuzzy. And part of the realization is, in this hyperpolarized world, that kind of leadership, tends to spark a lot of opposition, right? So for my political science friends, one of my favorite things from the political science classes I took in grad school is E. Snyder's the mobilization of opposing bias, right? So we're seeing, when it's polarized, that there's very, very rarely going to be a leader that's going to overdo that, right? So a lot of that, those strong leadership things, and the reality is that kind of strong leadership is great for winning elections, particularly in two-party system, but really bad for governing. Whereas the kind of leader that I think we need now is more of a facilitative leader. I think the superpower of leaders in the 21st century, for all the students in here, is not going to be that kind of skill set. It's going to be, hey, how do I know how to bring people together? How can I actually listen? How can I, learn to kind of struggle through these tensions? And that's the kind of, and luckily that's the kind of leader we often get locally. It's hard to get elected as a leader locally when you're just kind of a partisan, right? You can get reelected to Congress over and over, particularly in a lot of the districts, right? But local leaders have to work, they have to solve problems. They have to work across perspectives. So I think we have to rethink what we mean by leadership, and in this specific situation, what kind of leaders we need. And we need leaders that have the skill set to bring people together across perspectives to deal with their shared problems. Really quickly on the incentives to depolarization. Yeah, I mean, I agree very much with Dom, and trying to figure out how to regulate these things. But we are seeing more and more incentives, right? Particularly, a lot of the work I've done the last 2 years with journalism, local journalism is really in crisis. So there is a lot more money coming in now, not necessarily government money, but nonprofit money and philanthropy, of saying, hey, no, local communities need good journalism, right? And so they're providing a little bit more incentives that are kind of playing more of that role. Because it's pretty scary that if we're losing local papers, and then if that void gets filled by more partisan voices, then we're just going to get more of this kind of polarization. So there's some exciting thing. Colorado Media Project is one of those that are doing it locally. Really seeing local news, which I do think good local news has a significant depolarizing effect as a public good. Right? It's not going to survive as a private good. Right? People aren't going to pay a lot of money for good journalism because our brains want bad journalism. So how do we rethink the role of journalism and figure out better ways of funding it? And I think that would help.
And I'll just add that I don't know if Professor Hitt is in the room, but our own professor, yeah, he is in the back. Professor Hitt was published on this topic and has shown that a lot of news deserts, a lot of communities in this country that lost any kind of semblance of local journalism they do tend to become more polarized over time. So it does very much affect us. I think we've had a great 2 hours. I hope to see most of you at some of our other events. I hope you enjoyed this, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
I will say, if you're a student interested in the facilitation program, come tell me, come talk to me about next semester. And if you're a community person that wants to be on the CPD event notification email list, give us your email and we'll let you know about our events so you can join us.